IVM.
Hey all, I'm Rohan Joshi, and I'm so glad that this podcast, a show about crypto, has gotten such a great response. I've been having a lot of fun trying to decode how these new technologies can help us with the help of experts from around the industry. So if you're enjoying the show, could you please help a fellow crypto head out? We've got a listener survey going on, and you can fill it in under 10 minutes. The survey link is in this episode's description. And don't forget to tune into a show about crypto on the IVM podcast app and wherever else you get your podcast from. Hi, welcome to a show about crypto. Another week, another episode. This week, I have Rahul Sanghi, co-founder of Tigerfeathers, who has worked with Visa. And the topic we're here to grill him about, because I have many questions about this topic, is Web 3.0. Rahul, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rohan. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure mine. So my first question is, you've got Web 1.0, which was essentially our old sort of first bones of the internet, which is where there were static websites and we all accessed them. And then we got Web 2.0, which is this sort of social media web, user-generated content web that we all seem to live in. And now everybody's sick of that. We're already talking about Web 3.0. What is 3.0? I believe that there is a definition that describes it as the semantic web, but I feel like you think that that definition is outdated. So what is Web 3.0?
So you're correct, Rohan, in that the original vision for Web 3.0 by Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web back in the late 90s, was a vision of the semantic web, which was where data would be understood by machines the same way it's understood by humans, making the web a more intelligent place. But as we've seen over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, that term has been bastardized to an extent by the crypto sector, who rightly or wrongly paint the future of the web, which is rebuilt or built on top of these decentralized protocols, which harkens back to the days of Web 1, which was where the web was more interoperable and unconstrained by monopolization, which is what happened in Web 2.0 or the social web, which led to the growth of the tech giants that dominate society and the internet today. I guess to answer your question, I don't think we have a single definition of Web 3. You ask a bunch of different people, they'll tell you different things.
Okay.
But fundamentally, the way I look at it, it encompasses the broader ecosystem of crypto-based technologies and their applications. So whether that means in decentralized applications themselves, it means decentralized finance protocols, NFTs, DAOs, and everything in between. So that's the sort of working definition that I think people refer to when they say Web3.
Right. So to be clear, it's not because it's a term I see used interchangeably in so many places. Web3 and the metaverse are the same.
No. So it's very likely that Web3 principles and at least Web3 design principles will be incorporated in the construction of what should be a much better future for the internet, which is the metaverse, which is the internet realized in a more spatial way, which a richer experience, likely or best experienced in virtual reality, as opposed to the 2D interfaces we generally use to access the internet today. So I guess to simplify, Web3 principles likely will be used in the architecture of the metaverse if it is constructed in a non-Facebook or non-Zuckerbergian way in the future.
So all metaverse are Web 3.0, but all Web 3.0 is not necessarily metaverse, is one way of putting it.
Why I sort of looked up there is because obviously Facebook and Microsoft and the traditional Web 2.0 giants have all made large statements indicating their bullishness of a metaverse future. But if we just judge them by track record, especially Facebook, it would seem or it would appear likely that they intend on this metaverse to be closed, where they do control the traffic, where they do have an oversight, and where they do monopolize user data and user attention.
Sure.
But what would be a sort of promising outlook on this is if they do incorporate crypto technologies and decentralized protocols where NFTs, for example, aren't Facebook NFTs, quote unquote. Sure. They are just NFTs built on the Ethereum blockchain, be taken inside and outside of Facebook and to any other Web 2.0 platform. So, which is, I guess, the central philosophy Web3, which is you should be able to take your data and your identity across the web, as opposed to having it locked into these walled gardens that have been set up by Web2 giants.
So, okay, so let's stay with that for a second, because you mentioned this, and this is something that keeps me up at night sometimes, is because one of the fundamental principles of Web 3.0, like you said, build this beautiful decentralized place that belongs to everybody. And then, like you said, you've got Facebook making big moves, you've got Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard for 68 billion. You've got all of these happening. So are we faced with a bit of a scenario where we already at the sort of nascent stage have sort of camps where, sorry if I'm not being articulate here, but where sort of you have this idea and vision for a decentralized place, and you already have these monopolistic giants and institutional giants sort of walking in there. So how do we resolve this going forward? And how do we create a sort of Web 3.0 experience that stays? Because we've seen it, right? Fine, we have user-generated content in Web 2.0, etc., all of that. But like you said, at the end of the day, that data is still owned by like 4 guys, out of which one is Zuckerberg. So how do we bluntly, like put it in a short way, how do we stop the dream of 3.0 dying before it even gets off the ground?
So it's a question. And there's definitely some criticism that suggests that in a sort of fool therein to switch from our old centralized masters to our new centralized masters. But fundamentally, what Web3 promises is reduce the switching costs that come with traversing between different platforms on the internet and the take rates that platforms can command. So, for example, for a creator using Facebook or YouTube, like you guys did in the day to distribute your content, essentially the bulk of the spoils from that content were generated and enjoyed by the platforms themselves as opposed to the individual creators. But in fact, if you get to control your identity and your digital assets by using your private key, which I know you guys have discussed in previous episodes of the show, you should be able to command the economic returns that comes with the own outputs on these platforms. So it isn't necessary that we sort of are devoted to different a new set of platforms in the same centralized manner. The idea is that you reduce their absolute control over your internet experience and your ability to monetize your output on the internet.
So that's me as a creator, etc., all of that. And yes, a lot of creators, but there's also a lot of sort of laypersons who come to the internet largely as consumers, right? Like the average person, you still go in there as a consumption platform. So for these people, or how does Web 3.0 change, like say the layperson head experience or their internet? Like in a sense, why should they care bluntly? Like in what seems to be a reasonably, for them at least, a decent Web 2.0 world still and a reasonably rich experience. Why should they care about Web 3.0?
So one, I think that at least in the last 3 or 4 years, the narrative around privacy has changed a lot. Where maybe in the 2000s, we were more than happy to give as much of ours to these platforms in exchange for convenience and in exchange for sophisticated services that we thought we were accessing for free. But I think that narrative is changing and people are becoming more aware that their data is being used without their consent, packaged to advertisers that whose incentives to serve us in the right way is questionable. So if you have an internet that is based on an advertising-based business model, you can understand what leads to perverse incentives when it comes to users participating on these platforms. Whether that means these platforms serving us engaging or provocative content that incites us into incites us into activating more of our personalities on these platforms or acting more actions that leave a larger data trail. So we're sort of the playthings of both the platforms as well as the advertisers. And I think once people become aware that they should have the right to control who accesses their identities or who accesses their data and what they can do for them as opposed to the other way around, I think they will become much more attuned to the benefits of web. So even at the most simplest level, if you're an average internet user today, you might have your own profile on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Amazon. Each of these platforms is incentivized to keep you within their 2 walls or within their 4 walls to harvest your data and to keep you interacting and acting on these platforms. But in a world where you have the ability to sign on to these platforms using your private key, which you can then take yourself with you to any different types of platforms and give them consent to them using what's in your private key to assess who you are or what your background is. I think that just shifts the balance of power from the platforms to the individuals themselves. And I think that narrative will change over the next couple of years and people will understand more of why these technologies are beneficial to them.
Okay, so here's then another conundrum that we come to, right, in my head, which is that on the one hand, yes, today, whether it's Meta, whether it's Google, whether it's whatever, they're dipping into my data and they're probably doing horrible, horrible things. with it in terms of manipulating me like puppet on strings. And that is objectively horrible and terrible. But the sad truth of it is that the trade-off for the average consumer is that, yes, while you are trapped within their four walls, the being trapped within that four walls does create a sort of standardized, safer, and I'm using air quotes here for people who are listening, experience, in the sense that where there is a guarantee that there are certain things that will not be exposed to. There are certain things that will not happen. There are certain third or fourth party attacks that won't happen versus, say, your wider dark web, right? Which again, technically great sort of free place, liberated from these things of Google and Facebook and all of those people. But then also, because so sort of decentralized and this and that, also filled with pretty horrible shit, like bluntly, right? So how in a 1.0 platform or in a Web 3.0 world, where especially people are, because they're already reading sort of stories of like that, where people are going on to sort of metaversal platforms or going into places, and like women are already facing abuse and like, you know, like female avatars and this and that are already having a much worse time of it. Anyway, so how do we, can we, forget how do we, can we even, I don't want to use the word push because that would be a terrible thing to do, but how do we create sort of safe structured spaces even in a decentralized open internet? Because again, one of the issues with crypto also is people are just like, look, the problem with crypto is agar gaya scam mein hai, matlab, there's no authority you can go to like and argue with about. So how do we create that for the user?
So it's a very good question. And how, again, like I wrote a piece on this where I included an abuse or sort of a riff on an old Spider-Man quote, which is Web3 is the sort of manifestation of with great power comes great accountability.
Right.
And exactly like you mentioned so far, and I think it's changing, but to grapple with crypto platforms and to use, say, an online wallet or to interact with NFTs or DeFi or DAOs does require some level of technical sophistication. And the trade-off with controlling your keys and controlling your identity and your data is, like you mentioned, you don't some of the safety that comes with acting and interact on these Web 2 platforms that can sort of intervene if there's a case of harassment, if there's a case of abuse or any of the sort of stuff that you generally find Facebook and Twitter intervening and booting people off platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the important thing to remember here is that Web gives people an option. It's an option to dictate your experience. It's not a compulsion. And that's, I guess, where people tend to get stuck up, which is an absolute conversation between you have to from centralization to decentralization. There's pros and cons of worlds. And we do have a lot of ground to make up when it comes to user education and to ensure that this technology doesn't just or isn't just applicable for the crypto wealthy or creative audience.
Right.
So UX and security are probably the biggest two sort of pillars that Web3 will hopefully stand, that we certainly aren't there yet, but I would hope that it does change in the future. Because you do definitely do trade off some of the utility offered by web platforms when you go into this uncharted self-sovereign domain of Web3 that tends to sort of leave out users that haven't really figured out how to grapple with this stuff.
Okay, so in that situation then, are you saying, so does Web 3.0 sort of consume and subsume Web 2.0 or do they sort of coexist and people choose?
So they definitely coexist and people will choose, and there will be some sort of cross-pollination between the two. And I guess I don't want to add another sort of empty jar here, but the way I see it, on the sort of middle ground, for example, if you OpenSea is the largest NFT marketplace in the world, doing a stupid amount of transaction volume in the last year, indicating how people have sort of been drawn to this new technology. Some understand it intuitively, understand sort of collecting and digital art and these kinds of things. OpenSea takes a 2.5% transaction fee on every secondary sale of an NFT on the platform.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
So the conventional argument, the argument you might make is that, hey, we just swapped out the old central world for this central world, and NFTs, which are a decentralized technology, are all essentially funneled through this single platform. Hey, that's centralization. But in fact, there's two other ways to look at it. One is that you can take your wallet and go to any other marketplace on the internet and buy and sell NFTs using those platforms. So OpenSea doesn't sort of capture you or your identity or your profile there. It's just sort of a front-end interface for rendering those NFTs.
Right.
So one, switching cost is less. You can ostensibly switch from OpenSea to any other platform, a decentralized platform like LooksRare, for example. And two, take rate itself.
All right, we're on a show about crypto where I'm in conversation with Rahul Sanghi about Web 3.0. Time for a short break.
A wise man once said, traveling, it makes you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller.
Well, listen to such travel stories and experiences exploring India on the Musafir Stories with us, Saif and Faiza.
Catch us on the IBM website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Welcome to a show about crypto. I'm in conversation with Rahul Sanghi about Web 3.0. Also, I guess it's okay for you to take a bit of the pie if you're providing an actual intermediary service in between, right? Like opposed to this thing. I mean, you're allowed a fee for providing an intermediary service in between. Like you're allowed a payment for your services. You're just not allowed to. It's like, let me put it this way, all right? If I go to a key maker and I ask him to make me a key, he says, all right, you need to pay me $500 to make me a replacement key. I'm like, that's fine. That is a perfectly acceptable thing. If he says you have to pay me $500 to make a key and also I get to keep a copy of your key at all times, that's a problem, right? I feel like that's the problem. So as long as that's not happening, that's a good situation.
Exactly. And that sort of harkens back to the whole point of all this. It's the problem associated with advertising-based business models on the internet. And it's something that Mark Andreessen of and Horowitz, who also was the founder of Netflix, which provided the web's first commercially successful browser. He calls this the internet's original sin. Back in the 90s, when he launched Mosaic or when he launched Netscape, he really wanted to find a way to integrate payments directly in browser. But because the internet was this wild west at the time, that a lot of weird stuff was happening on, he couldn't convince the banks and credit card companies and payment processors to work with him.
Right.
So right from the original days, he couldn't find a way to integrate payments directly into the browser, which meant that users couldn't directly pay for goods, services, content, and information that they wanted to buy. And what that meant was that advertising became the default business model for the internet because it was the only business model that didn't require users to actually make a payment.
Right.
It didn't require users to share their card details or bank details with anyone on the internet. So it just happens that payment or money on the internet tended to flow through advertising. And that has led us to all of these downstream problems like data manipulation or data harvesting or third-party ad networks. And it's to the point you mentioned, you are more than happy to pay someone who is providing you for a service. No one is sort of looking for a handout. And that's the sort of, I guess, Web3 point of philosophy is that it's an internet that will be owned by the users and the builders who will be able to directly monetize their output or their work.
Okay, that's fantastic. And given that, you've worked with traditional financial giants like Visa, what is their sort of policy on this? How do they move into the Web 3.0 world, given that they have very specific and different? How are they looking at, how are traditional sort of financial people who process tons of sort of user money as it sort of goes through their ways? How are they sort of dealing with, and what are their positions on something like this?
So Visa's a sort of funny business in that it's probably one of the most recognizable brands on the planet. But I'm sure if you ask 9 out of 10 people what Visa does, they would say it's a bank, which is pretty weird. And what Visa actually is, it's a network. It's a network to help you move money around to facilitate commerce. Essentially, the sort of original days where Visa was sitting at the intersection of merchants, users or consumers and banks, and facilitating money flows between them to make lubricate the rails of credit more than anything else. So Visa is essentially a network. They are sort of pivoting or trying to embody something called the network of network strategy, where regardless of where customers are located or regardless of what type of money they want to use, Visa will help to facilitate that. So for example, what that means is, especially in the US and Europe, Visa has a bunch of partnerships with crypto wallets and crypto exchanges. So for example, with Coinbase, you can get a Visa debit card, which would allow you to spend your crypto that you hold in your Coinbase wallet at any merchant that accepts Visa.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that you actually, that the transactions are settled in Bitcoin or Ether or whatever the hell you're actually using. The transactions are settled in dollars, but
Right.
Visa will need to sit in the middle and facilitate the conversion of that crypto into dollar-denominated fiat.
Sure.
So it's a lot of similar sort of applications where if you use the card as a form factor, Visa is allowing you to earn Bitcoin rewards on your card spends and things like that. So it's not an adversarial relationship, Visa and Web3 or Visa and crypto, which is what you might expect. There's a much more mature stance towards seeing technology as something that consumers want, and that will likely form a big chunk of commerce on the internet in the future.
Okay. So speaking of commerce on the internet, my final question is we've seen cryptocurrency, we've seen NFTs. In your opinion, what sort of technologies or adoptions of this technology are you bullish about in the short term? I mean, I'm sure in the long term, we'll see a bunch of use cases that we didn't even think about, like happened with Web 2.0. But in the short term, given that we've seen crypto, which is straight up like one tradable asset to actual currency. We've seen NFTs, which is art, which is completely in the opposite direction. What else is there in the shop on this technology?
So I'm personally very bullish on NFTs. It's just that the idea of being able to represent scarce digital goods online is so insane that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of it.
Sure.
Just because it's being used so far as a flex, a status symbol, or as a way to make a quick buck. That dominated most of the narrative in the last year. But just that idea alone is going to be so profound in the way we represent all digital assets online. That is something I'm paying very close attention to, certainly. I guess the second is what the entire Web3 space means for creators. So I quit my job, but 5-6 months ago to go full time on my newsletter. One, because I'm an idiot. That's a fair point to make. But the sort of central point is that I'm trying to convert this into along with my partner and one of my old best friends, we're trying to convert this into a much larger media ecosystem. And the only reason I'm doing this is because I think Web3 will fill in a lot of the holes we've typically had for business models for media on the internet. Okay. So just in terms of, if you think about what Bitcoin did, it just provoked the idea that you do not have to have infinitely replicable media on the internet. Mm-hmm. You now have a way to represent scarce goods. And when you just ascribe that same philosophy to creators, you can understand why that's such a powerful idea.
Sure.
So that means that you don't need to have a million copies of a meme flowing through the internet. You have 100 people that think this meme has cultural value. And because now you have to represent cultural value in financial terms via tokens or NFTs, that just means that you have a way to monetize your creativity in a way you weren't previously able to do before.
Right.
It also changes the relationship that users have with creators, where typically it doesn't cost a lot to click the like button on Instagram and Facebook, but that does nothing for the creator whose work you're propending to support. But Web3 will convert your likes into tokens and give you a sort of way to support your creators that gives you a share upside. So you don't have to resort to altruism. You can actually buy a creator's tokens or NFTs, which represent a score of faith in their personal brand. And hopefully, as they increase in prominence or as they grow, you can grow with them and have a share, have a financial upside in their success. And obviously, new models for how people will interact on the internet. I know you've had episodes on DAOs. Just the fact that you can use an NFT as a symbol to create a community, or you can now create a community around certain content, which is what I'm trying to do. You can find different ways to sort of build those networks and lubricate those networks. Reward people for participating in those networks via tokens. So just in terms of a different sort of design architecture for the internet that has a completely different incentive set compared to the old world. I'm very excited at playing around and experimenting with this tech in that way.
Fantastic. Rahul, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. I am significantly clearer about Web 3.0 now than I was 30 minutes ago. And that's saying something, because I am a muddled up guy. So thank you so much for clearing that up. This has been great. We have been in conversation with Rahul Sanghi of Tigerfeathers, and this has been a show about crypto. Thank you all so much for watching. Rahul, again, thank you. And
thank you for having me, Rohan.
We will see you next week.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks to endocrinologist Dr. Altamas Sheikh. They discuss the various triggers for thyroid diseases and ways to keep our bodies safe from hypothyroidism. On Misconduct, we meet Unni Yarcha, legendary warrior of Malayalam literature. Raghavi and Nisha tell us how she took revenge against the man who killed her brother. On Press Decode, Sarah Vagda and Prafulla talk about illegal immigrations with reference to the Indian family that died while crossing the US-Canada border. On Ikka Dukka Economy, Abhinav and Dr. Junjunwala discuss the MSP farm law and its repercussions. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna tells us how we can make peace with the bad habits we just can't seem to quit. Also, just one quick announcement for everybody. We would like you to check out the new version of our Android app. It's available on the Play Store. It's a really interesting take on how to listen to podcasts. Do give it a look and let us know what you think. We're open to feedback on all of our social media channels. We're IBM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, do remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth really does help. And don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. And we have a number of channels there at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube where you can take a look at them. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
We know you love fast food,
fast fashion,
faster payment,
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Duggirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.